to, you may not have had the chance to look yet at the first two videos that I've done on this, but this is the third session, and there's a lot of focus, should we say, on HSG 48, because that's an expectation within this module to have a good understanding of it. But what I also want to do is cover the further reading, should we say, that's needed as part of this. So I'm just, if I can get to it. Trying to do the presentation. So we've made a couple of technical hitches here. Okay, it's, right, apologies there, but I think we're there where we need to be. So, HSG 48, it's a few years old now, early 90s when it was done, but the concept behind it, particularly on human factors, it's still a well-recognized document that's used a lot. It does focus, as you'll have seen from the other two sessions I've done on human factors, it does cover on error quite a lot, and the fact that humans are designed to fail. So we'll look at why that is, and we've talked a little bit about it on the other sessions, but I'm going to go more about the structure, the layout of HSG 48 and where they were coming from, and we'll cover the early bits on that. But I also want you to consider the wider reading that's expected. That's why I was saying before, I'll get you to, I've got a couple of quotes from these two books that I'm going to be putting in there. And again, the presentation you'll get a copy of later shows those books if you wanted to do a little bit of extra research. But it's not just that. The topic of behavior and behavioral safety is huge, and also the areas around reducing error and human factors is also quite big as well. So you can do a lot of research in this area. The Health and Safety Executive have got quite a few documents on the subject area, but there's more out there. So if you've not already downloaded it or you've not had a copy, if you go onto the HSC website, that's what it looks like. I think the title, it says reducing error and influencing behavior. I think it could be reducing error to influence behavior, maybe in some respects, because it does cover, and they are kind of intermingled in what it's trying to do. So the second edition that's in place at the moment went from looking at the disasters in the 1930s through to the 1980s. So it had some information in the first edition, and the second one really topped it up in the early 90s to show more about behavioral safety. So it grew in its design and concept. So the reducing error, or HSG 48, examines the human factor, and seeing as this module is all about human factor, I thought perhaps this is the best book to look at to start off with, should we say, in terms of what could or is in terms of what we're looking for in the module. And I thought it'd be good just to give you the outlay of what they're looking, or the concepts and the aims of the document itself. So human error and behavior, the general impact associated with it, the physical and mental health aspects are in that. And I look at it from the potential likelihood of this happening, and then similarly consequence associated with that. So when things do wrong, when the errors are made or the violations are made, what impact does it have? Then, as any risk control should look at, it looks at the practical ideas to identify, assess, and control the risk. So it's risk management. You know, it's early days in the interpretation of that, but nevertheless, it's risk management. And then you have the case studies. So quite a few examples from a variety of different backgrounds that helps to show what went wrong and what the company did to try and put it right. And then finally, especially suitable for managers, health and safety professionals, and employee representatives. So that was the audience it was aimed at in its design. It's a guidance document, so literally as guidance can be, HSG, health and safety guidance, take it or leave it. You don't have to be seen to be legally compliant with this. It's just considered, let's say, best practice to take account of it. What I would say is I think there would be a lot less accidents in the workplace if risk management took account of human factors more. And I think that's one of the key issues that tries to come out from the guidance document itself, is that if we influence this and build it into our risk management profiling, then it should reduce risk. So there's error and behavior, which we've covered in session 2. There's the human behavior and how other factors in the workplace can affect physical and mental issues. So we'll be talking a little bit about that in this session. Those practical ideas come out from the case study examples and the illustrative aspects of how those problems were solved. The structure of the 6 chapters and parts of it. So it talks about an introduction to the human factors, the failings and what we can do to reduce those failings, how to improve health and safety at work through better design. And I think that's a key area, and I'll be talking about that later, particularly from ergonomics. There's more we could do on the ergonomic side. And then thinking about when operators and people are working in complex risk areas, the human factors like shift work fatigue, communication, perceptions of risk, and the behavioral attitudes, and ultimately the impact it has on the health and safety culture within the organisation. So I'm not talking too much about chapter 4. I might have a chance to go into more detail on that on the 4th or 5th video session, but you can see how important that one is. How to get started on a behavioural safety programme that's addressing the human factor is in chapter 5. And then, as I mentioned before, quite a lot of case study examples of the human factor problems and how those companies attempted to address those issues. Ultimately, it's good practice that they're trying to look at. It is a guidance document, but in order to comply with legislation, it's considered the best way to look at practically, to look at how you can address a particular risk area. So the definition, should we say, of human factors encompasses those 3 areas of environment, organisation and job factors. Now, I guess the difference from my management training that I've had in years gone by, the difference perhaps is that environment aspect where you look at the individual, the task and the team. So if you look at individual, task and team and those 3 ideas, then that philosophy has been taken and put it into health and safety speak from the management ideas to then interpret it as job, individual and organisation. And basically what the HSC is saying is that by considering each of the 3 areas, the right balance or the best balance would be in the middle. We've incorporated all 3 equally. So a simple way to view human factors is to think about those 3 aspects and how they impact on people's health and safety related behaviour. Yeah. So, and that's the link then from the human factor then impacting on the organisational culture and also the way that people behave in crisis situations, but also in general issues, should we say, that are addressed in the workplace that could lead to increased risk. So the relevant factors, the relevant indicators, should say. Typically, they looked from a reactive point of view as to what went wrong. So you can see in there, accidents, human error, reports from occupational health, and then aspects around mental and physical ill health. So information you've gleaned after the event, absenteeism and sickness rates. And I would say not just absenteeism now, but also presenteeism is as big a concern, if not more than absenteeism itself. And the idea I have around that is that people who stay at work when they should be at home recuperating. And they hope that it's not seen or recognised by anybody of importance, but the performance is seriously impacted, and perhaps the team are also impacted by that lack of performance. Or they have to soak up more work because one or two people who are suffering from presenteeism are just not doing enough and incapable of doing more. Turnover levels, when you've got high levels of turnover, that's usually an indication that something's wrong in the workplace. Could it be that it's risk related in the way that you manage safety risk? And again, there are aspects around that link seriously to health and safety. Changes in legislation, rules, and also the way that health and safety is controlled in the workplace from a compliance perspective. I find that organisations that have ISO systems in place and procedures tend to be rule-based and system-based, and they will follow that particular compliance, non-compliance approach. Doesn't necessarily mean they have the right culture, but it's a driving factor. And again, the measurements, the monitoring tools that are used part of the compliance can be also used to show whether we've got good standards of human factors built into the workplace. Then there's the performance issues and behavioural issues associated with, identified typically through risk assessment, but it can also be after an incident where someone might be saying, the reason for this was the human element, and we need to do more on that to put it right. And also complaints, all kinds of complaints, but it's like the internal as well as the external customer, thinking about the stakeholders and individuals that are all collectively involved in making decisions, but also contributing towards incidents or the lack of. Now, I mentioned before that there's plenty of case studies used in HSG 48. So I'm just going to quickly go through this one, but then what I want you to do is to watch a video that I've got from YouTube, which is an American one, but it's really good in terms of supporting some of the theory around this. So if you look at taking care, it's one of the examples on page 7. This farmer was crushed under the wheel of a manure spreader whilst it was reversed. The driver was asked by the farm worker to move the tractor and spreader to allow access for cattle into a yard. He agreed to move it and intended to reverse it into another yard. However, as happens, when he got into the tractor, the farm worker was standing by the near side of the tractor. He started the engine, looked over his right shoulder and reversed. After 4 or 5 meters, he heard the scream and found the worker lying under the near side of the spreader under the front wheel. A witness had apparently seen the farm worker fall under the wheel. Now, in terms of conditions and environment, the ground was very muddy. The soles of the farm worker's boots had become smooth. The tractor was large and not fitted with rear view mirrors, as it was not used on the highway. So there's lots of little factors there. And when you perhaps think about the human factor, we can't ignore the other factors as well. And this is a part which I've talked in the other sessions, as to sometimes it is about pointing blame, and it should never be about pointing blame. It should be saying what went wrong and what was the root cause. And when we identify the root cause, what can we do in the future to prevent it from happening again? So everyone, farm managers and employees, were complacent in that reversing risk. And therefore, they didn't take care. In this case, there were a number of steps which could have been taken to reduce the risks, such as the mirrors on the tractor, checking and replacing boots on the farm worker. However, they weren't followed, and as a result, he slipped over whilst he was on the floor. The reversing was taking place, and unfortunately, he was crushed by the tractor reversing movement. So the good video that I wanted to use, if I can just escape from that, I'll try and go. I'll stop sharing this. Stop share. If I now go to where's the other one? Screen. So I go to share screen, go to
This potato harvester's manufacturer warned, before doing maintenance, switch the engine off and remove the ignition key. 2 workers would find out why the hard way. The harvester is pulled behind a tractor powered by the power takeoff and is designed to function without workers. It has large rollers that separate rocks, soil, and potato stems, debris also known as palm, from the potatoes. Before working on this farm, the 2 workers, worker 1 and worker 2, had never seen a potato harvester. They were assigned to grease components and change worn bearings of the home rollers. Although they had little training, they began the work. When they finished, their supervisor started up the tractor and harvester. 2 of the back rollers were not turning. The supervisor directed worker 2 to grease the bearings and replace any malfunctioning parts. The supervisor turned off the tractor and left the key in the ignition. He directed the workers to complete the task and then left the area. The workers changed parts on one side of the harvester. Worker 2 got into the tractor's cab and turned the key to start the tractor. He also activated the hydraulics powering the home rollers. With the machine running, worker 2 exited the cab and went underneath the web conveyor to see if the rollers were turning. Worker 1 climbed on top of the machine to visually check the rollers. He slipped. The unguarded rollers quickly pulled in his leg, crushing it. He called for help. Worker 2 ran and turned off the tractor, stopping the rollers. The supervisor and worker 2 tried to free worker 1. 911 was called. Rescue workers, unable to cut through the hardened steel components of the harvester, instead had to partially disassemble the machine. More than an hour later, the worker was freed. This accident could have been prevented. The employer should have had and implemented 1, a health and safety program to identify and address hazards. 2, safeguards. The farm owner had the guards for covering the home rollers, but never installed them. 3, de-energization and lockout procedures. Removing the key or disconnecting the power takeoff would have prevented the harvester from powering up. 4, effective supervision, which would have included checking that the workers were doing their jobs safely. And 5, training for the workers so that they could understand the tasks and the hazards. The 2 workers were from Mexico and spoke Spanish. Only worker 2 knew a little English. Even if a language barrier exists, employers are responsible for providing training in a language or manner that workers understand. With such limited training and experience, the workers never should have been assigned to work on a machine that could be so dangerous. As an employer, know the hazards and protect your workers from them.
I'm just going to stop the video. So you can obviously see that how things can go wrong, and in this case, the farm worker fell because perhaps lack of training or other reasons as you saw there. But nevertheless, in terms of root cause, there was something that motivated him to do what he did. And then there was lack of supervision to make sure that the approach used wasn't, should we say, followed to an acceptable standard. So I just wanted to use that because even though it's an American one, and I'm not one for promoting America in terms of standards of safety, but I just like the way that that video was designed. It does look at root cause specifically, but behaviours. So for me, I always ask why is that the case? So another part, going back to HSG 48, is it gets us to consider the human factor, and within it, thinking more than just what happened and what went wrong. It's trying to get you to consider the philosophy behind it. So when should we build in these human factors? It is in fact in these 4 areas. Look at it as part of the risk management and the risk assessment process. So after an accident, I know that my accident investigations tends to look at all areas as root cause analysis, but I certainly make sure that we consider the human factor, and then after that, I will revise the risk assessment accordingly, because it could well be that our control measures perhaps weren't communicated properly, or it could be that the risk assessment was good when it was originally done, but we've learned new ways of doing it, or they're now taking shortcuts or doing behaviours that are more risky. And as a result of that, it went into the accident causation. So it's time to review the risk assessment and then apply better controls. But one area that's left out too often is that design and procurement area around human factors. Quite often, companies who are going to invest in something and a new way of doing things, they will go perhaps to an outsider or even a supplier to say, we're thinking about doing this, we'll be going through a tendering process, but if you were to do this, what would you advise? And quite often the opportunity is missed to engage with staff and workers who are affected by those risks, and then changing accordingly. And then finally, in certain aspects of day-to-day health and safety management. So once you put things in place around human factors, how are you going to monitor it? If there's an expected behaviour, how are you going to monitor it? What are you going to do to measure it? And if it's found to be inadequate, what will you do about it? So thinking of the assignment, I guess, if you choose to do the forklift truck example, one thing I've done in the past is observation of drivers whilst they're on forklift trucks. And I have my little check sheet there, and it's focusing on the behaviours that they take, some of the things that we look and expect to see from a driver can be quite evident. So I put that into a checklist, and I literally watch them for 15 minutes, and then I get them on a one-to-one basis afterwards and say, during that 15-minute observation, this is what I saw. A good driver would be excellent, and there'd be hardly anything in the check sheet showing otherwise, other than deemed to be competent, working to the appropriate standard. However, typically, we see people who aren't quite driving to the standard they should do. Classic example of that, which I see time and time again, is not looking in the direction of travel. So perhaps whilst they are picking up a load off maybe a rack or the back of a vehicle, when they're reversing back, they're more focused on making sure that the load doesn't catch anything else as it's moving out, rather than being in control of the vehicle and looking in the direction. So they should maybe spend 10 to 20% of their time looking at the load and checking that, but 80% of the time checking that it's safe to move in reverse. And like I said, too often we see too many people focusing more on the load than the area and the environment they're in. So as I was saying there, in terms of behaviour change and behavioural interjection, in order to, one, identify how people do things, you need employee engagement. Two, and when you're doing those measuring and monitoring activities later on, to show that they are compliant and following the right behaviours, you need to engage with them and communicate effectively. Because otherwise, what you might have done on a piece of paper does not resemble the way it's done in the workplace. The other key thing for me is that involvement with employees. They tend to know the best way of doing things. They will tell you, you might class it as a shortcut, but they'll tell you the most efficient way of doing things. And as a result of that engagement, because they've been involved and you've been nice enough to talk to them about it, they're more likely to buy into the idea. So there's that aspect as well. There's an area of prioritization that needs, as is with any management issue. So again, engagement, where you want speedy reaction and activities done soon. Again, engage people to make sure your planning is going to be implemented in the line with the behaviours expected. And then that leads to change. Not everybody accepts change very readily, so the engagement helps to work through that change, and it's more likely to be effective if you engage with people. I apologise about the size of this slide, but again, it's just taking pages 9 and 10 of HSG 48 and looking at some of the serious disasters. But within the columns and the way it's written as such, you'll see that on the left-hand side, it talks about the incident that took place that resulted in a catastrophic event. Then it'll talk about the consequence, the catastrophe associated with it, but the human contribution and other causes. In every case, the learnings were that there was a link to human factors and human failings. And if you do some research on this, certainly when we cover it in the 3rd module, you'll see a lot as to what went wrong and why it went wrong. So I just wanted to point that out in terms of those major accidents, and in every case, there was a human element associated with it. But we've got to look beyond that in terms of incidents and accidents, and that's what it says in the guidance document itself. Is we've got to anticipate that things will go wrong because humans are designed to fail. We are set up to fail. Our brain processes information by training, experiences, and also sometimes through design of equipment. It makes us do things in a particular way. And also the culture within the organisation as well. So there's sometimes these issues that all contribute to the way a human behaves. And therefore, when we look at the human factor, we've got to put it into context with the failings of the company as well. And it could well be that these people that make these decisions have disastrous consequences. Even when they were aware of the risks, they still took the wrong behaviour, and it resulted in that catastrophe, should we say. We can also misinterpret the situation and act inappropriately as a result, because we are designed to fail. Both of these can lead to the escalation of an incident. On the other hand, we can intervene to stop potential accidents. So when we see things aren't quite right, and if we're doing monitoring of people and individuals, mitigate the possibility of the accident taking place by looking at humans as a resourcefulness and ingenuity as to, well, we could have done it that way, but we decided to do it a different way. And therefore the behavior is not in line with what's expected. So from a crisis perspective, we've got to look at the impact or the potential impact associated with when operators, crew, and people who are on the front face of these crisis situations. One, can they interpret the information effectively? Two, will they take the most appropriate safe action to prevent a serious incident? And that's where we build that into our risk control measures, or in a lot of cases, it's about training them so they have that experience. And I guess a classic one of this, one of my clients I've just been doing work with on fire risk, they have fire wardens that are trained up, and they have repeater panels in the production environment. And rather than, as is anticipated in most companies, when the fire alarm is activated, the response should be that people get out, the fire wardens or marshals go and investigate whether the potential fire alarm activation is in fact a real fire situation, and they can see the signs of smoke or fire itself, and then take appropriate action and make sure that the fire brigade are on the way to put the fire out. So that's typical of what you expect. However, this particular client of mine had decided that what they would do is get rid of the annoyance factor, the annoyance being the alarm itself. So they would silence the alarm first. That was the initial reaction. Silence your alarm, so then you can go and investigate. And if it's a false alarm, well, we're not disturbed too much, and we can carry on with our jobs. Now, I find that very concerning in terms of that's not what we want, because in what used to be a COMAR site level 1, the potential there was a fire could spread significantly in a short period of time, and rather than people being outside of the building, away from the risk, where an explosion could take place, and even worse, a secondary explosion because of the dust in the environment, the concern there was that they've not taken the appropriate action in the right priority and order. So I had to do quite a bit of negotiating with them, but it eventually turned out that the reasons why they had silenced the alarms and got into this attitude and behavior of silencing the alarms first, because of the number of false alarms they'd had over a 3-year period, when they used to have a beam alarm system in the top of the warehouse. And from production, you would have, every now and again, you're going to get a cloudburst of dust, and that would make its way into the warehouse at high level, and it would activate the beam. Now, over a 3-year period, they were getting to the stage where the fire brigade were sick and tired of the false alarms. So they were getting pushed, should we say, by the externals to say, do something about it. So it became the norm, and this is quite a few years ago, it became the norm to silence the alarm as your first investigatory approach, and then confirm that it is in fact a fire or not, and then after that, contact the fire brigade. But there was always this issue of whether people were going to get out safely during that period of time. So I've worked with them, and then I asked the question about so what went on with the beam, and what do we need to do about the beam? And the answer was, oh, we've not had the beam in place now for 3 years. We took it out because it wasn't needed, and our insurance company agreed that we didn't need it, so we'd taken it out because of all the false alarms. Okay, fair enough, but they hadn't addressed the behavioural issue and how, in a fire situation and a fire alarm activation, what needed to take place. And again, through investigation, I found out there have been 3 incidents after the beam had been removed, in which there was 2 of them was small fire, the 3rd one was a smouldering smoke on a bearing in the production environment, which they managed to put it out before it became a fire. But nevertheless, I find it concerning to say that they still silence the alarms, even though they've had 3 incidents where theoretically the fire brigade should have come out. So I have to work on that, and I have to get them to appreciate that alarm, when it goes off, what the purpose of it is and what behavior is anticipated and expected when these things happen, and certainly to change that behavior to a safer approach. I'm getting there. I'm not all the way there yet, but as a result of security team that's just been brought on site and their interpretation of what they have to do in a fire alarm situation or activation, then due to that involvement, it's given me the opportunity to say, if you're going to use them with your fire wardens, this is the way we're going to do it. And thankfully, they are now listening, and I've already trained a few, and will continue to train them to that standard for the future. In this one, I've used a separate book. This was from a book called Safety Simplified that NEBOSH have produced. It's probably at level 5. Sorry, no, I would say level 3, 4. It's not something you need for NEBOSH certificate, but it's a good introductory standard, should we say, to give you an idea about safety. And I guess the title gives it away, but it was interesting that NEBOSH have produced this. But Ken Woodward, when he had his incident, some 20 or 30 years ago now, I think it was 2006, was it? In 2006, Queen Elizabeth II Award. Sorry, that was the OBE he received afterwards. So this guy was blinded by the accident at Coca-Cola, and since then, if you see in the final paragraph there, he's been going around preaching the word as to what went wrong, because he was very much, he says, that I was at fault for the error that was in place, and the procedure wasn't understood. I hadn't had the training, and ultimately my employer allowed me to do these things that led to a dangerous situation. So there's that aspect to it. But IOSH, the Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, in the Managing Safety course, they produced a video to talk about what went wrong. And as is the case with a lot of safety behavioral training we're getting nowadays, they throw in the aspect of emotion. So it comes across from a personal perspective, from Ken's discussion points, but not just Ken. It talked to the supervisor that was in charge and how guilty he felt, the manager that was overseeing this and how bad he felt as a result of that, his wife and family as a result of Ken becoming blind and the changes to their life. So they focus that. And as I said there, you can get this from Vimeo, and it's 23 minutes long, but I've used this video quite a few times when I was delivering the IOSH Managing Safety course. And thankfully, Ken has managed to turn it around and use it in his life and make a difference. And hopefully he's influenced many organizations. But nevertheless, as you can see, the human cost can be large. And I'd like to think that Coca-Cola Schweppes changed and it had an influence in the way that they did things, as should be the case after any accident, should we say, and certainly something as serious as this one. But he was really badly burned as a result of getting the mix wrong and putting the substances together in the wrong order. Another example that's in there in HSG 48 is the tanker. So an experienced road tanker driver had virtually completed the filling of his vehicle. And the focus here is on distraction. So in that vehicle, from a bulk tank of flammable liquid, he was transferring it through the piping system into the tank. A telephone rang nearby, so he had to, or felt compelled to answer that. He left it for 5 minutes. He closed the various valves on the installation and went to answer it. On returning to the vehicle, he'd forgotten, because of that distraction, he'd forgotten that he'd not disconnected the pipe system from the, or the hose from the installation. And in doing so, drove off. The pipe work from the installation fractured and approximately 1 ton of material was lost as a result of that distraction. There's another good video that you might want to watch. I've got a copy of it if anybody wants it, but I've used it again on IOSH courses and also construction related courses that I've run, whereby Joe, who's on a scaffold, has a mobile phone call and it shows you the various levels of accident, from near miss, nothing happening really, but a bit of a chat as a result of it, through to a minor incident, through to him falling off the scaffold and being impacted so much that he couldn't work again. And then the ultimate is a jogger that was running by wrong place, wrong time. The plank that came off that he was carrying at the time, the plank fell off outside the perimeter of the fence, hit her on the head and caused fatal injury. Now, the company that produced this, Cost of Accidents, it's called, the video, it shows the various levels of incidents from nothing happening all the way through to the circumstances changing slightly through to that fatality, and then using the triangle of near misses through to fatality in terms of risk and gambling. So it's a good way of interpreting the potential of something going wrong. So that's from page 14 of HSG 48. I just wanted to kind of like give you the humor aspect of this, but you may have seen this one before, but hopefully it'll work. I use it for a DCEA training, so explosive atmospheres and the potential for something to go wrong, but the human error, should we say. So we've got a tanker pulling into a garage, it's a Shell tanker. One of my students, actually, from when I was at Salford, he said he was involved in the investigation of this, and the ramifications to changes in the work as such were major, because if you think about all the tanker drivers that they have and the training that was necessary to change that particular potential of something going wrong. So you've got, as would be expected, a tanker delivery coming into a garage, and then they're going to connect up to then deliver the petrol in the back of the tanker straight into the tank under the ground. So you can see the pipes available, everything's ready for that. Now, the procedure was at the time that you needed to check the level of fuel that's inside the tank. You can probably see that these underneath the hood of the garage, so it was a little bit dim. So he reaches into his pocket and gets out what he thinks is a good idea at the time to be able to see inside. So he gets a lighter. As soon as he actually uses the lighter, he realizes the error of his ways, and the explosion resulted in him being thrown off. He was rolling around at the bottom once he'd been thrown off. But as this doesn't carry on showing you the extent of it, but as a result of that incident, they just ran away, expecting the place to explode. Nevertheless, rather than an explosion, it was a serious fire. And obviously, with the amount of fuel that was available there, it carried on for 4 hours before action was taken. So just thought I'd use that as an example of human error. In this one, I wanted to show you the HSG 48 version of errors and violations. So you can see the flow chart there on the left. But inside the book that I was talking about before, one of the books by Tim Marsh, this one, A Definitive Guide to Behavioural Safety, he uses a kind of a fix approach to this. So starting off with those typicals of unsafe acts and behaviours that can lead to incidents. You've still got errors and violations in there. You've got the skill-based errors and the mistakes, and then you look further on that and break it down. So for each of those, there's a fix. And what Tim is saying in his book is that we should build this into our development program and behavioural safety to make sure that we anticipate the human factor. So when they can have physical slips on the job, so go back to the tractor before that ran over whilst reversing the guy that slipped onto the floor because he hadn't changed his safety shoes and it was in a slippy environment. So look at the ergonomics, look at the design, look at the way they do the job as a fix, and consider those factors, and simply go through each of those potentials, errors and violations, anticipate them, but then build it into your risk management profiling. So as you can see, it comes up quite a few times. You've got ergonomics, design, reasoning, training, discussion, agreeing what's best in terms of change, applying that change the environment, tolerate or change the way that people are doing the violations, clear leadership. So you've got systems in place and links to HR and line management in terms of perhaps disciplining people if they don't follow the rules and if they continue to have this attitude of violating. So there's a whole chapter discussing this particular issue and getting risk managers to perceive this, but building into the behavioral safety program. And if you can focus more on what can go wrong and then managing the risk by putting the fixes in place, you will definitely reduce the potential of a serious crisis or major incident. So that's the idea behind that one. So chapter 2 focuses a lot on the errors and the violations, which, as I mentioned before, I'm not going into too much detail because we've covered that in session 2. But at the end of every chapter, it gives these key messages, talks about what can go wrong, what did go wrong, what we need to focus on. And as you can see there are 2 main types of failure, errors and violations. Controls will be more effective if the types are identified and addressed separately, because you should treat error and violation quite separately. Similarly, taking disciplinary action against individuals, I find that useful in terms of the ripple effect. If you single someone out and say the way that you're working is not acceptable, the behavior that you are showing is not acceptable, we will take you down the disciplinary route. It does have a ripple effect in terms of others that then see this and say, well, we can't obviously breach the system without thinking of the consequences. So at the end of all those chapters, it gives the keynotes. Chapter 3 then, looking at, which is quite a big section around this, looks at ergonomic design, job satisfaction from a mental well-being point of view, the procedures that need to be in place to support that, to make those ergonomics aspects efficient, and human reliability around those areas from design. Now, I thought it worth looking at some of that, but also I thought it even better to think about wider reading. And one of the areas of wider reading is Industrial Guidance 90. And in that Industrial Guidance 90, it talks about the ergonomic aspects to prevent or control or mitigate some of the aspects of human factors. So starting off with something from that, so I'll come back to HSG in a minute, but in Industrial Guidance 90, look at those workplace issues that you may find problems, such as people being unable to see important displays. And that for me is about stimuli and alarms or visuals or something that says it's not quite what it should be, take action. The fact that we might be unable to reach the controls because of ergonomic positioning, or it isn't put in the right place. I guess if you think of machinery design now, and certainly as a result of pure provision use of work equipment regulation, there's been an upgrade in where the safety stop should be. The most important control measure, I guess, on any machine is to be able to access the safety spot. So that means in some larger pieces of kit, it needs to be accessible. You have to look at your operating position and variations on the operating position. So rather than just providing one safety stop, it might have several, because you know you have to walk around to different positions whilst loading raw materials, or checking that the tooling is in the right place, or making sure that the machine drive is working, and so on and so forth. So fault diagnosis and thinking about the impact from that. And I'll always remember the incident whereby a guy was killed because he'd switched off the machine, went into the danger zone. Whilst in the danger zone, someone else came along and switched the machine on because they hadn't followed the tag out procedure. As a result of that, the press came down and killed him, squashed him. And so again, thinking about other safety control measures and things that have to be in place to prevent things from going wrong when maintenance, cleaning, and other similar investigative activities are taking place in a position where they can't be seen. So comfortable position comes in there as well. Think about fatigue and the impact of that. Overloaded with too much information. So taking too much in because the signs and signals are too much. And then finally, the inattentive. So sometimes they have so little to do that they switch off, they get bored, they're easily distracted, or even fall asleep or become tired more quickly. So those aspects as well should be brought into in terms of the ergonomic problem and thinking about it. So within that industrial guide note 90, it gives you a list of things to consider. I'm not going to read all the questions out there, but you can see there you can easily adapt that in the workplace to try and prevent. You can ask the questions, you can observe people doing things and then convince yourself or otherwise that the control system and the way of working is adequate and the equipment does its job, or there are problems or people are more likely to take shortcuts, or there are issues around the layout and design of it causing, I don't know, postural issues, overstretching issues, position being compromised and so on and so forth. So there's that area that can be used just by a simple checklist of this type. So it asks you the question, and the purpose behind it is to look at the workplace problems associated with ergonomics and how it impacts on the human factor. From that, how can you best solve it? What can you design in to make it more comfortable? For example, ensuring that emergency stop buttons are positioned so that people can reach them readily when they need to. But ergonomics also deals with psychological and social aspects of the person and their work. So are they in silence all day or no? More likely to be involved with other workers on the team where they want to chat and work with and solve things together. What are they doing and how safety critical is this? For example, a workload that is too high or even too low, with unclear tasks, with time pressures, with inadequate training and poor support from managers, all of these can work together to become a negative effect on the people, the way they work and how they do it. Therefore, it's going to cause problems. I thought I'd share this one with you. The company no longer exists, so I have no issues around copyright on this, but I just thought I'd share it with you. I was asked to look at a video of how they do the work. And on this is in fact a safety control. It's a trip switch. So what the attachment to that switch is a line, a safety line. And part of the job is to look at quality as to whether it does the job, and then move on to the next one. On the top, sorry, in the middle on the right hand side there, you can see signals. So when you put the hammer down, should we say, the operator that's checking this out is looking at the signals on the back panel, and if there's a failure, they will look to what was causing it. So just in case you can't hear her here, she knows that one's problematic. She puts it to one side, but she believes she knows how to fix that problem, so she'll come back to it later. From an ergonomic perspective, Sheila was suffering with wrist inflammation and tennis elbow. And I'm hoping you can see by the nature of the work and the speed of it and the amount that she's asked to do, I'm hoping you can see the links to the movement by the arm, the positioning of the arm, the number of times that she moves from left to right, the forces required, the posture is in a strong position, the height of it. Perhaps if she was stood up higher and that was lower down, she might have been in a stronger position to reduce that risk. But, you know, ultimately, this is a quality check. Maybe there's another way of doing this. Maybe there might be a machine that you can put this into and the machine would do it instead. But that would get the company to change from a manual to a mechanical way of doing things, automation. And that in itself perhaps could be compromising jobs. So we've always done it this way kind of approach comes into it. And Then they've realised after a few years of doing this that it's now causing problems and perhaps we should do it differently. So we started looking at this, but it then led me to look at the tools they were using and the way it was done and how it was done. Lots of discussions came about from that to try and make an improvement in it. We eventually did go down the route of changing to a semi-automated way of checking, and she would push a button rather than have to pull a lever. The other aspect was consistency and quality around that. By bringing in this semi-automated machine, it wasn't reliant on that Sheila's, in this case, pull to the right, to the left, to the right, to the left. It wasn't relying on the pressure and the amount of pressure she was applying on that. There was quite a few issues. Eventually, we made some of the areas safer, but at the expense potentially of people losing jobs. And that I found to be an issue in safety quite often is if you, maybe for ergonomic point of view, you look at things and you make changes, you might be saying for the safety of that individual, perhaps we need to semi-automate it or even mechanize it. But by doing that, you might be putting their job at risk. And then the skill base has to change as well. If you're going to bring in a complex machine to do that, the skills of putting something in place, pulling the lever down, turning it left and right and checking it and looking at a visual, that's very different to the skill base now of loading into a machine, making sure the machine works. If the machine errors, being able to put it right. So now you're looking at someone, say a technician, rather than an operator, and the skills associated with that. So again, there's a lot involved in what's required around ergonomics. So Industrial Guidance Note 90, decent document, worth having a read, focuses on ergonomics, but there's a big part of it is human factors. Going back to chapter 3, in the Industrial Guidance 48, knowing that you have an ergonomic problem is a great starter, but you've got to have some means of assessing that. Quite often companies don't want to look at that, but it's an important part. And it might be addressed because of incidents, near misses that have taken place that's pushed it forward. You may find problems from people being unable to see important displays, unable to reach the controls, unable to work in a comfortable position, overloaded with too much information, and then inattentiveness. Now, that's very, very similar to what I've just gone through with the Industrial Guidance Note 90. Yeah, the theory is slightly older, but the same problems coming up again. So it's the same approach to managing the risk. And there you go, surprise, surprise, the questionnaire that comes from table 2 inside the HSG 48 is very, very, very similar. 90% of it is exactly the same as what was in Industrial Guidance Note 90. But nevertheless, 2 documents, independent documents, asking you to look at the same thing. Check out the various circumstances around ergonomics and the impact it has on operators, the human factor. Table 3 then gets you to look at the variation on that in terms of how you can design the control measures from an ergonomic perspective to make it more efficient and also to get people to react in the manner anticipated and expected to reduce risk. The layout of the design and the controls and the positioning of them, what they look like, is got to be related to how people react from stimuli. And then what is the expected outcome from turning a switch or pressing a button. So they've got to have that knowledge and understanding, but they've got to be able to apply the skill and behavior in line with the knowledge and understanding. Now, again, I go back to that book, which I've read through from Tim Marsh, A Definitive Guide to Behavioural Safety. And I like his variation, should we say, on this in terms of incidents that have gone wrong. So with the 3 Mile Island example, he stipulates the control panel looked symmetrical and sexy, but it was difficult to use. The workers had tried to retrofit usability by using different beer cans. And he uses Coors as an example for one lever and Michelob for another, that doesn't really matter. But it was important to them to be able to identify or distinguish the difference. When the alarms went off, they couldn't be overridden. So the employees, struggling to think straight whilst all the noise is going around, felt themselves in a nightmare of ergonomics, and that affected their decision-making process. In the Bhopal issue, workers failed to take heed of a gauge. So that gauge had been faulty for a while, or they thought it was faulty. The purpose of the gauge was to identify pressure levels, and unfortunately in this case it became dangerously low, and it was too late. So as you can see there, it says in terms of Tim's words, at Bhopal, workers failed to take heed of a gauge that was warning of a leak because it was frequently broken. It was only when the pressure gauge started to climb alarmingly quickly that they realized it was broken. It wasn't broken at all, but it had accurately been reporting worryingly low levels of pressure. And by then it was too late. So what we're saying in the human factor associated with that is people's interpretation of stimuli, information that comes to them. If it's not regularly effective, then they will determine that the pressure gauge is probably wrong again because it's broken. Or in the 3 Mile Island issue, they couldn't interpret it effectively enough, so they ended up designing their own way of approaching that. In both cases, that was a major factor towards the disasters. So in critical safety decision making, it must be simple, easy to follow and reliable. It's got to be well understood and applied correctly. So the next stage, I guess, is to consider the psychological side. When we look at designing equipment, technological equipment and so on, and the impact it has on safety, it should follow a simple process. And that pattern of the causes and effects is a typical flowchart used to say, how would someone respond and what impact does it have on them? And if it's too demanding from a performance perspective, how is it going to then bring on stress, fatigue, and mental health conditions as a result of that, and ultimately affect a decision-making process, which could be critical. So again, it gives advice about what you can do to improve that environment from a stress control point of view and the thought process around that. It's a complementary approach about the organizational job design factors. But if you go back to the beginning, it's the individual that's affected by those organization and job factors. Solutions here will, in the long run, be more cost effective as the underlying work-related causes will be identified and resolved. So it goes back to human errors, human violations, things that go wrong and the reasons why. So in the design or the redesign, we've got to think about those job characteristics and how it can be easier for them to put in place, not just so they can get it right, but it's going to create less stress or mental health as a result of it. So variety of tasks, autonomy, completeness or feeling good about the job, and regular feedback that reimposes that they're doing a good job. Further in that, it talks about job rotation, job enlargement, job enrichment, autonomous work groups, and employee engagement and involvement. So the classic management styles of getting it right. In the bottom left there, I've shown from within section 3 as to how it links to the case studies. And within those case studies, they've said stress is part of that. So look at K, O, and P for those stress-related factors. And then case studies which show how involving employees is helpful, A, B, D, N, and Q. And again, they would suggest that we think about those redesign of work to consider it ideally needs to be accurate written procedures, be clear, concise, and appropriate to the level of detail, and so on. So get that involvement, get that understanding, watch them and make sure they're following it, using familiar language and terminology that everybody understands, universal in some respects, and again, taking account of where it can be misinterpreted or wrongly applied. Inside another book they've got, so the Fearless Organization. This is about psychological safety in the workplace. And quite a bit of research done by Amy Edmondson here. And within that, there's quite some focus on many areas of psychology. But I just thought I'd bring out this why fear is not an effective motivator, and used Ratatouille as an example. So Remy, the rat, who was the hero, needed to overcome this tyrannical restaurant chef who ruled the kitchen with an iron rod, should we say. He needed to get past that in order to realize his dream of becoming a chef. So that's used by Amy as an example of fear and motivation. Some managers still follow this rule of power and fear, and they believe that people are compliant and do what they're told because they don't want to experience those nasty consequences of not complying and not doing what they were told to do. That fear that's pushed on them. But in reality, from research, fear is proved to inhibit learning. Fear is proved to consume psychological resources, diverting important information from the brain at times when you need to make decisions. It affects our working memory and also our ability to process information. So again, if it's in a critical safety position, it can be misinterpreted or applied wrongly. However, if you take the ideas behind psychological safety, the idea being that a belief that there are no consequences of interpersonal skills, the staff can ask questions, they can admit openly to failures without consequence of blame or discipline. There's a safe environment in which they work. Any mistakes are used as an opportunity for learning. So with that in mind, there's a lot that can be done to change the culture of an organization, but importantly, to move away from that fear factor that's quite too often wrong. Going back to HSG 48, this compliance idea and thinking about warnings and stimuli signals that are put forward, you can see that quite often we do comply, and perhaps we comply in the right timeliness, but there are also errors relating to that. I used it when I was at University of Bolton. I was the health and safety advisor there for 8 years. And I used to find some of the international students, particularly Nigerian and also other parts of Africa in that region, would not react to a fire alarm activation. They didn't, it wasn't within their culture to, the alarm goes off, I take action. It just was an annoyance. They didn't think of that in the same way. So I had to quite often, as part of my fire warden and key response, first responder, was to go in and find 2 or 3 people still inside, say, the library or parts of the technical areas where learning provision was there, and they carry on regardless. So I would literally go over and switch off the computer and say, get out, in an aggressive manner, to make sure that they understood they were doing something wrong. But that's just one example of how people don't always comply in the way that we expect. There's quite a bit of research done on warnings and alarm activations. And one of the videos that still tickles me today is showing that when a fire alarm goes off, how a person will look around and see what the other people are doing. So they've noticed the warning, but they will only actually take action if other people take action as well. So if nobody else moves out of the room, they won't do anything. And this was proved as part of the research, that people stayed inside because they didn't want to look as the weak link compared to the other people in the room, and they didn't perceive the risk as being an issue. But if we look at, I think it was Woolworths fire in 1971 in Liverpool, the psychology behind it, there were, I think, 11 people died on the 4th floor where the restaurant was. and 9 of the people were in the restaurant area, and they'd paid for their meal. Now, this is an assumption, but it's validated by the investigation and the theories by the investigators at the time, that they believe that because the people had paid for their meal, they had also assumed that it was a false alarm. They couldn't see any signals, stimuli like fire or smoke, and they stayed in the building, continued to eat what they paid for, and didn't take the appropriate action. And unfortunately, by the time they did take action, it was too late, and they were found dead, making their way to the exit, and they'd been overcome by smoke. So it's an interesting, but there are other factors like the layout of that floor. There was no visual line. One of the sounders wasn't working. So because it was a weak signal, it didn't quite give the same kind of impact, and so on and so forth. So when I look at this example here of a table showing they notice the warning, they read the warning, they comply with it, and the levels of response, quite alarmingly, is not as 100% as we would like it. Unfortunately, it's typical of human nature and the way they react in this case. So just to finish off, I just thought to talk a little bit about human reliability assessment, because it is talked about in that chapter 3 before we finish. So there are a variety of different techniques you can use for human reliability of assessment. HAZOPs is one, as you'll see in the next slide. Threats is another, but there are a lot. I think in the guidance document, so the research document that we'll see, there's 35 different types. And when they looked at it, half of them, 17 of them, were considered to be effective. The other 18, they believe, don't really add any performance improvements. But nevertheless, this particular document was set up to look at human reliability. I guess the important thing is dependence on level of risk within your organization. And if it's critical, like as it says here, it's used in nuclear, offshore, and chemical processing industries. So there's a major impact associated with that. The method is generally applicable and can be used in those sectors and others. 3 main reasons: giving a benchmark for safety cases and design briefs. So they will do these research and then help to influence what the new way of working could be. It enables comparison of alternative designs or organizational solutions. So again, it becomes part of the risk management program, and also to identify the weaknesses in what already exists so that appropriate action can be taken. So I mentioned a research document. It's titled The Review of Human Reliability Assessment Methods. It's RR679. And I've just picked out one of the pages that talks about THERP as an example technique for human error rate prediction. Like I said, there are 35 discussed in this document, but I've just pulled out one as an example. It gives a description of how it works and what's involved. And then, as I've put on the right-hand side there, it talks very briefly about the pros and cons. So THERP was the first one, 3.11, and it seems to be accepted, particularly in nuclear, in 3 different countries, should I say. So because of that, I thought, well, it's readily accepted and used a lot. And then it uses others further down that somewhat variations on a theme, but that human error rate prediction is common throughout. It talks about the pros and the cons, so the goods and the bads associated with it, and what more could be done to improve. So again, it's part of my objective of this session to get you to consider further reading about human factors. I just wanted to go through that. Then just to link that, there's a decent TED talk done by Astratella, who's the Chief Executive Officer of X. He used to be called ex-Google, but he also likes the title of Captain of Moonshots. And within his TED talk, he explains this quite well, but I've just taken a section out of the Fearless Organization again. And Astro believes that it's superior economic strategy to reward people for killing unpromising projects. So the title here is Make It Safe to Fail. And what we're saying is allow that environment, allow that culture to be in place whereby it's better to try and fail than it would be, as it goes on to here, to let unworkable ideas languish in purgatory for years, and whilst it's languishing, soaking up resources unnecessarily. Yeah, so it's under the section of the fearless workplace, but it's also the subtitle of Make It Safe to Fail. And then further, Amy goes on to discuss what Teller highlights, not just in the TED Talk, but in several documents, how unpleasant it feels for us to fail, especially at work. It's natural to worry what other people will think and about losing our job. So what they're basically saying there, you've got to make the environment of the people susceptible to things going wrong and making things go wrong, but failure becoming part of the norm to get to success. And you've got to go through many failures before you get to the best way of doing things. That's why, unless a leader expressly and actively makes it psychologically safe to do so, people will seek to avoid failure. So allow failure to take place, make it safe for failure to take place, and then encourage it so that you can use your resources more effectively and get it right eventually. So rather than just being in a design team or a workable environment, it's very different. It's collectively engaging and working together. Okay, so hopefully I've covered a little bit more, should we say, of the key points of HSG 48, but also I've got you to consider the further reading associated with human factors, and then ultimately the concept of human factors and the role that it plays, not just in accident causation, but also on effective risk management. Okay, so that's the end of the session from me. Just about right. It's with 5 minutes to spare, so I said 1:30 till 3:30. Just want to check, has anybody got any questions, issues they want to raise? Just going to have a look at the chat. Can you send the link?
If you can send over all the links to the videos and things like that, and obviously a copy of that PowerPoint would be really beneficial.
Definitely, yeah. I'll
Thank
do
you.
that. Okay. What I'll do is I'll send you a copy of the presentation, but also put a list together on the information.
Brilliant, thank you.
Graham, is there a 20% off job calculator for this